300 of the most powerful people in America turned to stone the moment Alexandra Whitmore set down her champagne, crossed the entire ballroom in front of senators and CEOs, and pulled out the empty chair beside the one man who hadn't so much as glanced at her all night. "You're the only person in this room who hasn't tried to sell me something," she said. Daniel Carter didn't even look up from the worn photograph in his hands. "That's because I don't have anything you'd want." And then she asked him the one question that would burn both their lives to the ground. If you're watching, drop your city in the comments, so I know how far this story travels tonight. And if stories about ordinary men with extraordinary backbone are your kind of thing, hit subscribe and stay with me to the end. Because what happens next, nobody saw coming. The Hartwell wedding was the kind of event where the guest list was worth more than most countries' annual budgets. It happened twice a year, maybe, in Washington. A gathering this dense with power. Two old families merging through marriage, and every name that mattered within 500 miles had received the engraved invitation and cleared their calendars. Defense contractors stood shoulder to shoulder with the senators who funded them. Tech founders worth more than small nations laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, all because the person telling them controlled access to something they needed. And in the center of it all, like a planet too heavy to ignore, was Alexandra Whitmore. People called her Lexa, but only the ones who didn't actually know her. The ones who knew her called her Ms. Whitmore, or didn't call her anything at all because they were too busy waiting for her to look in their direction. She moved through the room, and the room reorganized itself around her. That was the only way to describe it. A congressman peeled away from his wife mid-sentence when he saw an opening. A venture capitalist who'd flown in from San Francisco that morning had been rehearsing his 30 seconds for a week. A woman who ran one of the largest media companies on the East Coast touched Lexa's elbow and said something that made Lexa smile, the smile she used on cameras, the one that never reached anywhere near her eyes. "Alexandra, you look incredible. We absolutely must do that interview before—" "Have your people reach my people, Diane," Lexa said, already moving, already gone. She had been doing this for 19 years. Since she was 26 and had taken the small logistics software company her father left her and turned it into Whitmore Global, a company that now touched the supply chain of nearly every product in America. If you bought groceries, drove a car, took medication, or turned on a light somewhere in that long invisible chain of how it got to you, there was a piece of software Lexa Whitmore's company had built. She was 45 years old, worth $11 billion on a quiet day, and she could not remember the last time someone had spoken to her without wanting something. That was the thought sitting in her chest like a stone as she scanned the ballroom. Not loneliness exactly. She'd have rejected that word if anyone had offered it. It was more like a kind of deafness. Every conversation in the room was the same conversation. Every smile was a transaction in progress. She could predict the next 45 minutes of her own life with depressing accuracy, who would approach, what they would ask for, how she would deflect. And then her eyes caught on something that didn't fit. A man. Alone. At a corner table near the back half in shadow, where the lighting designers had clearly never expected anyone important to sit. He wasn't looking at her. That was the first thing she noticed, and it landed strangely, because in 19 years, she could not recall the last time she'd walked into a room and found a man not looking at her. They always looked. Even the ones pretending not to, she could feel them tracking her at the edges of their vision, waiting for their moment. This one wasn't waiting for anything. He was looking down at something in his hands, turning it over slowly, and whatever it was had his complete and total attention, in a room engineered to demand attention from everyone. "Who is that?" Lexa asked. Beside her, her chief of staff, a sharp young man named Marcus, who knew everyone, followed her gaze and frowned. "Where?" "Corner, table 14, by himself." Marcus squinted. "No idea. Want me to find out?" "No." She kept watching. The man wore a navy dress uniform, not the showy kind, but the real thing, the kind that had clearly seen actual service. The fabric had the slightly worn look of something pressed many times. There was a single ribbon bar on his chest, modest, and his shoulders had the particular set of a man who had spent years carrying weight other people never saw. "Probably somebody's +1, Marcus offered. "Military liaison, maybe. The Hartwells have defense connections." He lowered his voice. "Want me to clear your path? The Hendricks group has been circling for 20 minutes. Lexa didn't answer. She was watching the man lift whatever he was holding closer to the candlelight, and now she could see it was a photograph. A small one, the kind people use to keep in wallets before phones swallowed all their pictures. The edges were soft and frayed from handling. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's already memorized, but needs to see anyway. For one absurd second, Lexa Whitmore, who had stood across negotiating tables from heads of state, who had once made a Fortune 500 CEO cry in a conference room, and felt nothing wanted to know what was in that photograph more than she had wanted to know anything in months. Ms. Whitmore? A new voice. A man in a charcoal suit had appeared at her shoulder hand already extending. Gerald Voss Capital. I've been hoping to... Excuse me, Lexa said, and then she did something that made 300 people stop breathing. She walked away from Gerald Voss from Voss Capital, from a man who managed $40 billion and had flown across the country for this exact 30-second window, and she crossed the entire ballroom in a straight line toward the corner table where the Navy officer sat alone. The room noticed. The room always noticed where Lexa Whitmore went. Conversations stuttered. Heads turned. Somewhere near the bar, a woman murmured, "Where is she going?" And her husband, who knew everyone, whispered back, "I have no idea who that is." Lexa reached the table. The man still didn't look up. She pulled out the empty chair beside him. The scrape of its legs against the floor was the loudest sound in her world at that moment, and she sat down. "You're the only person in this room," she said, "who hasn't tried to sell me something." The man slid the photograph carefully into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket, the way you'd handle something irreplaceable. Then, and only then, he looked at her. His eyes were tired. That was the second thing she noticed. Not unkind, not cold, just tired in a bone-deep way that no amount of sleep was going to fix. He was maybe a few years younger than her, with the weathered, sun-creased face of a man who'd spent real time in real places. "That's because I don't have anything you'd want," he said. And he said it not as a line, not as a clever opening, but as a simple statement of fact, the way you'd tell someone the time. Then he reached for his water glass and took a sip, and it was clear from his whole posture that as far as he was concerned, the conversation was over and she could leave whenever she liked. Lexa Whitmore had not been dismissed by anyone in 19 years. She found to her own astonishment that she liked it. "You don't know who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am." He set the glass down. "Should I?" A laugh escaped her, a real one, short and surprised, nothing like the camera's version. "Most people think so. Most people are usually wrong about most things." He glanced toward the dance floor where the gleaming, glittering machine of the wedding kept turning. "Especially in a room like this." And what's wrong with a room like this? He considered the question seriously, which she also wasn't used to. People usually answered her fast, eager performing. This man took his time. "Nothing," he said finally. "If you like rooms like this." He looked back at her. "I'm guessing you don't, or you wouldn't have crossed the whole place to sit with the one guy who isn't anybody." Lexa felt something shift in her chest, a small, unfamiliar loosening. "What's your name?" she asked. "Daniel." "Daniel what?" "Carter. Lieutenant Daniel Carter, United States Navy." A pause. "Logistics." "Logistics." She tilted her head. "I'm in logistics too, in a way." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "I doubt we mean the same thing." "Try me. You mean spreadsheets and shareholders," he said. "I mean making sure 12,000 pounds of medical supplies, fuel, and food gets to a forward base on the other side of the planet on time in one piece, when half the route is trying to fall apart and the other half is trying to kill you. I mean the difference between a kid in a uniform eating a hot meal or not, between a hospital ship having blood on hand or not." He shrugged, almost apologetic for the weight of it. Different kind of logistics. For a long moment, Lexa didn't say anything. She, who always had something to say, who could fill any silence with strategy, she had nothing. "You're right," she said at last quietly. "We don't mean the same thing." A waiter drifted by with a tray of champagne. Daniel waved it off. Lexa took one out of habit, then found she didn't want it, and set it down untouched. "So, who dragged you here?" she asked. "You don't exactly look like you're having the time of your life." "Commander's wedding. Sort of." He turned the water glass slowly between his fingers. "The groom's father was my CO years ago. Good man. Pulled me out of a bad situation, once the kind you don't forget. When the invitation came, I figured I owed it to him to show up." He glanced around at the marble and the chandeliers and the orchestra. "Didn't realize show up meant this. And tomorrow I fly back to my daughter." He said the word daughter, and something in his whole face changed, the tiredness pushed aside for a second by something warmer and fiercer. "And the day after that I start getting ready to deploy again." The photograph. Lexa understood now. "Your daughter," she said. "Is that who—" "Emma." He didn't reach for the photo again, but his hand drifted toward the pocket where it was an unconscious thing. "She's 7, going on 40 most days. Where's her—" Lexa stopped herself, but not fast enough. "Mother." Daniel finished his voice even. "Gone. Left when Emma was 3. He said it without bitterness, which somehow made it land harder than bitterness would have. Decided this life wasn't what she signed up for. The deployments, the moving, the not knowing. Can't entirely blame her." His jaw tightened just slightly. "But she could have said goodbye to the kid. That part I haven't gotten over." Lexa, who negotiated for a living, who could read a room and a man and a deal in seconds, was finding it harder and harder to read this conversation. Because she kept waiting for the turn, the moment where he realized who she was, recalibrated, started angling for something. It was the only kind of conversation she knew how to have. Every interaction in her life was a kind of fencing match where both people had hidden objectives, but there was no turn. This man had told her his daughter's name and the worst thing that had ever happened to him, and he wanted nothing from her at all. "That must be hard," she said, and immediately hated how thin it sounded. "Raising her alone, with all of it. Some days." Daniel finally let himself smile, a small, tired, real thing. "But she's the best part of my life. Easy. The Navy, the deployments, the people who left, that's the hard part. Emma was never the hard part. Emma's the reason the hard part is worth it." And there it was. The thing Lexa hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten its shape. Envy. Not of his money, he obviously had little. Not of his power, he had none. Not of his comfort, his life sounded brutal. She envied the simple, unbreakable certainty in his voice when he talked about that little girl. The way he knew beyond any doubt what mattered and what didn't. She had $11 billion, and a calendar booked solid for the next 18 months, and a board of directors and 4 homes and a private jet, and she could not have said with that kind of certainty what a single one of them was for. "You're looking at me strange," Daniel observed. "Sorry." She shook her head. "I'm not used to this." "Used to what?" "Talking to someone who isn't performing." The words came out before she could manage them. "Everyone in this room wants something from me. A meeting, an investment, a photo, a favor they'll call in later. Every single conversation I have is a negotiation, even when both of us pretend it isn't." She looked at him. "You don't want anything." "No," Daniel agreed. "I don't." "Why not?" He looked at her, then really looked, the way he'd looked at the photograph, and something in his expression said he'd finally registered that the woman beside him was somebody, even if he still didn't know exactly who. "Because whatever you've got," he said slowly, "money, a name, a company, whatever's got all these people circling you like you're a watering hole in a drought, none of it can do the one thing I actually need." He turned the water glass again. "It can't be there when my daughter wakes up from a nightmare while I'm 8,000 miles away. It can't read her a bedtime story over a satellite connection that cuts out every 90 seconds. It can't make her stop asking why her mom left." He set the glass down with a soft final click. "So no, ma'am. I don't want anything from you. There's nothing you have that solves my problems. No offense." "None taken," Lexa heard herself say. But the truth was, it was the most direct and useful thing anyone had said to her in years, and it had cut clean through something she'd spent 2 decades building up. "My name," she said, is Alexandra Whitmore. She watched his face for the flicker of recognition, the recalibration the moment the dollar signs went up behind a person's eyes. She'd seen it 1,000 times. She braced for it now with something close to dread, because she didn't want this conversation to become like all the others. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly. Whitmore. He tested the name. Like the trucks. The shipping thing. I think we use your software. The supply tracking system on base. The new one they rolled out last year. He nodded slowly, putting it together. That's a good system, actually. Saved us a lot of headaches. Whoever designed the redundancy protocols knew what they were doing. Lexa stared at him. In 19 years, the response to her name had been awe or hunger or fear or careful fawning calculation. It had been, oh my God, and I've read everything about you, and can I just say what an honor. It had never not once been a Navy logistics officer telling her that her software's redundancy protocols were well designed because he used them to move medical supplies through war zones. Yes, she said. That's mine. My company. Huh. Daniel nodded as if she'd told him she was a dentist. Well, nice work. The old system used to lose entire shipments in the database. Yours doesn't. He paused. You should be proud of that. Real people's lives are easier because of it. That's worth more than all of... He gestured vaguely at the ballroom, the senators, the glittering crowd, whatever this is. And that was the moment. Later, when Lexa tried to explain to herself how everything that came after had started, she would always come back to this exact moment. Not the moment she sat down. Not the moment he said he didn't want anything. This one. The moment a tired Navy father told her that the thing she'd actually built, the unglamorous invisible machinery that moved supplies and saved lives, was worth more than the entire room full of people who'd spent years telling her how important she was and meant it because to him, it was simply obviously true. She had built an empire and surrounded herself with people who flattered the empire. This man hadn't even heard of the empire. He only knew the part of it that helped a kid in a uniform eat a hot meal. And he respected that part and was politely indifferent to all the rest. Lieutenant Carter, she said, can I ask you something? You can ask. She wasn't even sure what the question was until it was halfway out of her mouth. Something had cracked open in her some long-sealed door, and what came through it surprised even her. When you're out there, she said, 8,000 miles away, when everything's falling apart and people are depending on you, and you haven't slept, and you're scared, because I imagine you do get scared. She watched him, and he didn't deny it. How do you know what's worth doing? How do you decide what matters when everything's screaming at you at once? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the orchestra swelled into something slow and golden, and couples drifted onto the dance floor, and the whole gilded machine of Washington power kept turning. And none of it touched the small, still circle of these two people at a corner table. You really want to know? He asked. I really do. You ask yourself one thing. He leaned forward, slightly elbows on the table, and for the first time all night he seemed fully present, fully engaged. The tiredness burned off by the seriousness of the question. You ask when this is over and I'm telling the story of who I was, will I be proud of what I did here? Not will it work out. Not will it be easy. Not what will people think. He held her eyes. Just will I be able to look my daughter in the face and tell her I did the right thing even when the right thing cost me. That's it. That's the whole thing. Everything else is noise. Lexa Whitmore sat very still. Will I be able to look my daughter in the face? She repeated softly. Or whoever it is, you'd be ashamed to lie to, Daniel said. Everybody's got somebody, even people in rooms like this. Find that person and you've got your compass. He leaned back. Took me a war to figure that out. Cost me more than I'd like to admit. But it's the truest thing I know. Across the ballroom, Marcus, her chief of staff, was watching her with open bewilderment. No doubt fielding a dozen quiet inquiries about why Alexandra Whitmore had abandoned Gerald Voss to sit in the dark corner with a stranger for going on 20 minutes. Gerald Voss himself was watching too, his expression curdling from confusion into something closer to insult. People were noticing. People were always noticing where Lexa Whitmore went, and a slow ripple of speculation was already moving through the room, the kind that would have consequences she could not yet see. She didn't care. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Alexandra Whitmore was having a conversation she didn't want to end. "I should let you get back to your evening," Daniel said, misreading her silence. He started to rise. "I imagine there are people you actually need to—" "Sit down," she said. "Please." He paused, half standing. "I have spent 19 years, Lexa said, and her voice was lower now, stripped of all its boardroom polish, "building something. And I'm very good at it. I'm one of the best in the world at it. And about an hour ago, standing in the middle of this room, I realized I couldn't tell you what any of it is for." She looked up at him. "And then I saw you, looking at a photograph in a room full of people who'd kill to get my attention. And you didn't look up once. And I thought that man knows something I don't." Daniel slowly sat back down. "And I was right," she said. "You do." The orchestra played on. Somewhere a champagne cork popped and people laughed. A senator was telling a story to a circle of admirers near the bar, and across the room, the bride and groom were dancing, and the whole vast theater of power and money and influence performed itself exactly as it always did. And in the corner at table 14, a billionaire and a Navy father talked. They talked about Emma, who was learning to ride a bike, and refused to let Daniel hold the seat. They talked about deployments and the strange grief of missing a child's whole year in 9-month chunks. They talked eventually, and almost without meaning to, about Lexa's father, dead 12 years now, who had built the original company in a garage and told her on his deathbed to never let anyone take it from her, and how she'd spent 12 years obeying that single instruction so completely that she'd forgotten to ask what she was supposed to do with it once it was hers. "He told you not to lose it," Daniel said gently. "He didn't tell you to disappear into it." "No," Lexa said. "He didn't." She was quiet. "I never thought about it like that." They talked for 2 hours while the wedding emptied out around them, while the powerful people gave up waiting and went home, while the orchestra packed up and the catering staff began clearing tables and casting them curious glances. They talked until they were nearly the last 2 people in the ballroom, and a tired event manager hovered nearby waiting to reclaim the room. "I have to go," Daniel said, finally checking a watch that was government issue and scratched. "Early flight. Emma's with my sister, and that woman will never let me hear the end of it if I'm late for the handoff." "Of course." Lexa stood when he did. And then, because the version of herself who calculated everything seemed to have stepped out for the evening, she said, "Lieutenant Carter, I don't suppose would you have any objection to me having your number?" Daniel looked at her for a long evaluating moment. And whatever he saw, it wasn't the billionaire, and it wasn't the empire, and it wasn't a transaction. "I should tell you," he said. "I'm not somebody who's going to be useful to you. I've got nothing to offer. No connections, no money, no influence. I'm a single dad who's gone half the year and broke the other half. If you're collecting interesting people for some kind of, I don't know, I'm not it." "I'm not collecting anything," Lexa said, "for the first time in a very long time." Daniel studied her another moment. Then he reached into his jacket past the pocket where the photograph lived and pulled out a small worn notepad and a pen. The analog tools of a man who didn't trust technology with the things that mattered. He wrote a number, tore the page, and held it out. "For what it's worth," he said as she took it. "You seem like somebody who used to know what mattered, and forgot. That's not the same as never knowing." He picked up his cap from the table and settled it on. "People who never knew you can't help them. People who forgot." He shrugged. "Sometimes they just need somebody to remind them." He nodded once, polite and final. "Good night, Ms. Whitmore." And Lieutenant Daniel Carter, United States Navy, single father, logistics officer. The only man in a room of 300 who hadn't wanted a single thing from her, turned and walked out of the emptying ballroom toward an early flight and a 7-year-old daughter, and a life that had no room in it for billionaires. Lexa stood alone among the abandoned tables, holding a torn scrap of notepad paper with 10 digits on it, and she could not have told you why her eyes were stinging, or why her chest felt cracked open, or why she suddenly, desperately did not want to go back to any of the 4 houses where no one was waiting up for her. Across the empty room, Marcus appeared, jacket over his arm, ready to debrief, full of questions about the night and the contacts she'd missed and the calls she'd need to return. "Ms. Whitmore." He ventured carefully. Everything all right? That was. I have to ask. Who was that? Lexa looked down at the scrap of paper in her hand. That, she said quietly, was the first honest conversation I've had in 19 years. She folded the paper once carefully the way Daniel had folded the photograph and tucked it into the place over her heart. What neither of them knew, what no one in that emptying ballroom could have known, was that somewhere near the bar 20 minutes earlier, a man with a phone had idly photographed the most powerful woman in America, leaning close to an unknown Navy officer in a dark corner, laughing in a way the cameras never caught. And that photograph was already sitting in a stranger's pocket waiting. It would not wait long. The number sat in Lexa's phone for 3 days before she did anything with it. This in itself was extraordinary. Alexandra Whitmore did not hesitate. She made decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars before her coffee got cold. She had once fired a regional director by text message between 2 meetings and felt nothing but mild efficiency. Hesitation was a luxury for people who couldn't afford to be wrong, and she had built her entire life around never being wrong. But she sat in the back of her car on Monday morning, the city sliding past tinted windows, and she stared at the contact she'd entered: Daniel Carter. No company, no title, just a name, and she did not press call. You're quiet this morning, Marcus observed from the seat across from her tablet balanced on his knee, already running through the day. The Henderson acquisition closes Thursday. Legal wants 20 minutes before lunch, and the board's asking about the Q3 projections again. They want... Push the board to Wednesday, Lexa said. Marcus's pen stopped. They specifically asked for Wednesday, Marcus. He made the note without comment, but she caught the small, careful glance he gave her, the one that said he'd noticed something was different and was too smart to mention it, because something was different. She'd noticed it herself in the way the things that used to fill her completely now felt slightly hollow, like a song she'd heard so many times she could no longer actually hear it. She'd gone home Saturday night to her penthouse with its panoramic view of the city she helped run, and she'd stood at the window with a glass of wine she didn't drink, and she'd thought about a 7-year-old girl learning to ride a bike who wouldn't let her father hold the seat. And she'd thought about a man who folded a photograph like it was made of glass. Will I be able to look my daughter in the face and tell her I did the right thing? Find that person, and you've got your compass. Lexa didn't have that person. That was the thing she kept circling back to in the small dark hours. She had a dead father, whose last instruction she'd obeyed for 12 years like a curse. She had a mother in Florida she called twice a year out of obligation. She had an ex-husband who'd lasted 4 years and left with a settlement and a kind of relieved exhaustion she still remembered. She had no children by choice, by schedule, by the relentless logic of a life that had never had room. She had $11 billion and 300 people who wanted things from her, and not one single person she'd be ashamed to lie to. On Tuesday, she called him. He didn't answer. It went to a voicemail with a flat automated voice, and she hung up before the beep. Feeling absurd, feeling 16, feeling like an idiot. Alexandra Whitmore did not leave voicemails. She had people who left voicemails. He called back 4 hours later. She was in the middle of a meeting. The Henderson legal team, 6 lawyers around a conference table, when her phone lit up with the name, and she stood up mid-sentence. "Excuse me," she said. "I need to take this." 6 lawyers stared at her. Nobody interrupted a Whitmore global acquisition meeting. She walked out anyway into the empty hall and answered. "Carter?" "Ms. Whitmore." His voice was the same, tired, even unhurried. "Saw I missed a call. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine." She leaned against the wall and realized she had no idea what she was going to say. She who scripted every conversation. "I wanted to thank you. For Saturday. For the conversation." A pause. "You don't have to thank me for talking." "I think I do, actually." She closed her eyes. It's been a long time since anyone talked to me like I was a person instead of a door they were trying to get through. She heard something in the background on his end, a small voice, high and insistent. "Dad, Dad, Dad!" And then Daniel's voice muffled away from the phone. "1 second, sweetheart. Daddy's on the phone. Yes, you can have the blue one. Hang on." And then back clearer. "Sorry. That's Emma. We're negotiating cereal. And Lexa laughed a real one alone in the empty corporate hallway with 6 lawyers waiting behind a glass wall. High stakes, she said. You have no idea. She drives a harder bargain than anyone I've ever met. Probably could run your company. A rustle, the sound of him moving to another room. What can I do for you, Ms. Whitmore? Lexa, she said. Please. And you don't have to do anything for me. That's sort of the point. I'm not used to it, but that's the point. There was a silence on the line, and she thought she might have miscalmed. It might have been too strange too much. But then he said, okay, Lexa, like he was trying the word out. So if you don't want anything, and I don't want anything, what is this? It was a fair question. It was in fact the exact question her entire being was built to avoid, because a relationship with no objective, no leverage, no return on investment, made no sense inside the operating system she'd run for 19 years. I don't know, she admitted. I genuinely don't. Can it just be a conversation? People used to do that, didn't they? Talk to each other without an agenda. In theory, Daniel said. She could hear the smile in it. I'm told it used to be common. Then can we do that, just talk? Sometimes, when you're not deployed and I'm not. She gestured at the glass wall, the lawyers, the empire, even though he couldn't see it, doing whatever this is. I leave in 5 weeks, he said quietly. The smile had gone out of his voice. Deployment. 9 months give or take. It's never exactly give or take, it's always more. So if you're looking for somebody who's around, I'm about the worst option you could pick. I'm not looking for anybody, Lexa said. I told you that. I'm just... She stopped. Tried again, and what came out surprised her. I'm trying to remember who I was before I became this. And for some reason when I talk to you I get a little closer. That's all. That's the whole thing. The line was quiet for a long moment. Behind the glass, one of the lawyers tapped his watch, and she held up a finger. Okay, Daniel said finally. We can talk. Sometimes. When the cereal negotiations allow. When the cereal negotiations allow, she agreed. And that was how it started. They talked over the next 5 weeks more than Lexa had talked to anyone in years. Not every day he was busy in a way that had nothing to do with calendars and everything to do with a 7-year-old and the looming machinery of deployment. But often. In the morning sometimes while he made Emma's breakfast and Lexa sat in her car in traffic. Late at night sometimes when Emma was asleep and Lexa was alone in the penthouse and neither of them quite wanted to hang up. He never asked her for anything. That was the part she still couldn't get used to, even as it became the thing she came to depend on. Every other relationship in her life ran on a current of mutual usefulness. This one ran on nothing she could name. He didn't want her money or her connections or her name. He didn't even seem particularly impressed by them, which she found against all logic enormously attractive. She learned about his life in pieces. That he'd grown up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a mechanic, and joined the Navy at 18 because it was the only way out he could see. That he'd worked his way up through enlisted ranks before earning his commission, which meant he'd done the grunt work, knew it from the inside, and had no patience for officers who hadn't. That he'd met his ex-wife at a base in San Diego and married her too fast the way you do at 23, and that the marriage had cracked under the weight of the life he couldn't change. That Emma had been the one good thing to come out of it, the one thing he'd fight the whole world to keep whole. She asks about her mom sometimes. He told Lexa one night, his voice low so as not to wake the kid in the next room. Not as much as she used to, but sometimes. And I never know what to say. The truth is too ugly for a 7-year-old. But I won't lie to her either. So I just... He exhaled. I just tell her that her mom had her own troubles, and that none of it was Emma's fault, and that I'm not going anywhere. Even when I go somewhere. That I'm always coming back. Do you believe that? Lexa asked. That you're always coming back. It was a heavier question than she'd meant. He didn't dodge it. I have to, he said simply. If I let myself believe anything else, I couldn't do the job. And I couldn't be her father. So I believe it. Most days. The days I don't believe it, I don't let her see. Lexa, in her penthouse, looked out at the lights of the city she helped run and felt something she had not felt in 19 years. She felt small, and it was the most honest she'd felt in as long as she could remember. She in turn told him things she'd never said out loud. About her father, who'd loved her fiercely, but only ever in the language of the company who'd taught her balance sheets instead of bedtime stories, who'd told her she was special because she was a Whitmore, and that the world would always try to take what was theirs. About the loneliness she'd never had a word for because admitting to it felt like an admission of failure. About the specific hollow feeling of being celebrated by 1,000 people and known by none of them. "You ever think about just stopping?" Daniel asked her once. "Walking away from all of it?" "And do what?" Lexa said. "It's all I am. It's all I've ever been. Without the company, I'm just a rich woman with no idea what to do with her hands." "That's not true." "How would you know?" "Because I've been talking to you for a month," he said. "And the woman I've been talking to isn't a company. She's somebody who's been pretending to be a company for so long she forgot there's a difference." A pause. "Same as I've been pretending to be a uniform. We're not so different that way. We both built somebody we could survive inside of." She had no answer for that. It was too true. 3 weeks before his deployment, she did something she hadn't done in a decade. She cleared a weekend. Actually cleared it, told Marcus to move everything. Take her off everything that she was unreachable for 48 hours, and watched his face cycle through confusion and alarm, and finally, a careful, hopeful curiosity. "Is everything all right, Ms. Whitmore?" he asked. "Everything's fine, Marcus. I'm taking a weekend." "You don't take weekends." "I'm aware. I'm taking one anyway." She flew to Norfolk, where Daniel was stationed. She didn't tell him she was a billionaire flying private. She just told him she was coming, and he gave her an address that turned out to be a modest 2-bedroom house in a neighborhood full of modest 2-bedroom houses. Base housing, the kind of place where everyone's car was at least 8 years old and there were bikes in every yard. He opened the door in jeans and a t-shirt, looking nothing like the man in the dress uniform, looking somehow more himself, and behind him, a 7-year-old girl with her father's serious eyes peered out from around his legs. "Emma," Daniel said, "this is my friend Lexa. Remember I told you a friend was visiting?" Emma studied her, with the unsparing, unimpressed assessment that only small children possess. Lexa, who had stared down senators and CEOs, found herself genuinely nervous. "Are you the lady from the phone?" Emma asked. "I am," Lexa said. "Dad smiles when he talks to you," Emma announced with the brutal honesty of someone who hadn't yet learned not to say true things. "He didn't used to smile on the phone." "Emma," Daniel said, a warning and an embarrassment all in one syllable. But Lexa crouched down, getting on the girl's level, and said, "Well, he makes me smile too, so I guess that's fair." Emma considered this. Then she said, "Do you want to see my room? I have a fish. His name is President. He's a betta fish. Dad says I can't get a dog because we move too much, but a fish is okay because a fish is portable." "I would very much like to meet President the fish," Lexa said gravely, and Emma grabbed her hand with the total instant trust of a child who had decided you were acceptable and dragged her into the house. Over Daniel's shoulder, as she was pulled past him, Lexa caught his expression. He was watching his daughter take the hand of one of the most powerful women in America and lead her off to see a $2 fish named President. And his face held something so soft and so wary at once that it made Lexa's chest ache. That weekend rearranged something in her she'd thought was permanent. She helped make grilled cheese sandwiches in a kitchen the size of her penthouse's closet. She sat on the floor and lost 3 straight games of Candyland to a gleeful 7-year-old who did not believe in mercy. She watched Daniel braid Emma's hair before bed with the patient competence of a man who'd taught himself a skill. Nobody had ever expected him to need his big hands working carefully through the small sections, Emma chattering the whole time about a girl at school named Sophia, who was either her best friend or her mortal enemy depending on the day. And on Saturday night, after Emma was asleep, Lexa and Daniel sat on the back steps of his small house, under a sky with actual stars in it, drinking cheap beer from his refrigerator, and Lexa said, "I don't want to go back." "You have to," Daniel said. "You've got an empire to run." "I know." She turned the bottle in her hands. "But I don't want to." He was quiet a moment. Then, "Lexa, I have to be honest with you about something, because you've been honest with me, and you deserve the same. Okay? I leave in 3 weeks, for 9 months, maybe longer. And when I'm out there, I go dark for stretches, weeks sometimes, where I can't call, can't email, nothing. And this life. He gestured at the small house, the quiet street, the stars. This is it. This is everything I have. I'm never going to be rich. I'm never going to be powerful. I'm a single dad with a government salary and a daughter who needs me and a job that takes me away half the year. He looked at her. You live in a different world, a completely different world. And I can't figure out how this works. The math doesn't math. And I've got a kid in there who's already been left by one woman she loved. I can't let her get attached to somebody who's going to fly back to a penthouse and remember this was all very charming and never come back. Lexa was quiet for a long time. You think that's what I'd do? I think it's what would make sense for you to do, Daniel said gently. And I think people usually do what makes sense. That's not an insult. It's just, I have to protect her. She comes first. She always comes first. So before this goes any further, I need to know, you understand that I'm not a project. And neither is she. We're not an interesting weekend for a woman who has everything. We're a whole life. A small one, but a real one. And if you can't be in it for real, his voice didn't waver, then it's better you don't come back at all, for her sake. I'd rather she remember a nice lady who visited once than learn to need somebody who's going to disappear. It was. Lexa thought the single most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. He was sitting on the steps of his tiny house with nothing to offer and everything to lose, and he was telling the 11th richest woman in America that she wasn't good enough for his 7-year-old unless she could prove it. And he meant it. He would walk away from her, she had no doubt, if he decided it was best for Emma. There was no leverage she had over that. There was no offer she could make. His daughter was the one thing in the world that her money and her power could not touch, and he knew it, and so did she. I've spent my whole life, Lexa said slowly, being wanted for what I have. My money, my name, my access. Every relationship I've ever had ran on what I could do for the other person. She turned to look at him. You're the first person who's ever told me that the thing I have isn't enough. That you'd walk away from all of it from me to protect a 7-year-old's heart. Her voice caught. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Do you understand that you just made me more sure, not less? Daniel didn't say anything. I can't promise you I know how this works, she said. I don't. The math doesn't math for me either. But I can promise you this. I am not going to be a woman who visited once. I don't know what I'm going to be, but I know it's not that. She took a breath. I haven't wanted anything real in 19 years, Daniel. Now I do. And I'm not going to let the fact that it's complicated scare me off. I built a global company out of things that were complicated. I think I can handle one small house and one little girl and one stubborn man who braids hair better than I do anything. For a moment, he just looked at her. And then slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted into that almost smile, the real one. You really lost at Candyland 3 times, he said. That child cheats, Lexa said. I want it on the record. She moves the gingerbread men when she thinks you're not looking. Daniel laughed a real laugh, low and warm, the kind that came from somewhere deep and didn't get out much. And in the small dark yard under the actual stars, 2 people from 2 different worlds sat close enough that their shoulders touched, and for a little while, neither of them said anything at all, because nothing needed saying. She flew back Sunday night a different woman than the one who'd left. She felt it in her body and the way she looked at her penthouse when she walked in all that glass and emptiness, all that view of a city full of people who knew her name and not one thing about her. She poured a glass of wine and didn't drink it the way she did. And she stood at the window and thought about grilled cheese and Candyland, and a man who'd told her she wasn't enough and made her feel for the first time like she could be. She didn't know it yet, but it was already too late to keep it quiet. Because 1,000 miles away, in a glass office of his own, a man named Gerald Voss was looking at a photograph on his phone. A photograph he'd bought for a not insignificant sum from a guest at the Hartwell wedding, who'd thought it was funny that the great Alexandra Whitmore had blown off $40 billion to sit with a nobody in the corner. Gerald Voss had been embarrassed that night. Gerald Voss did not forgive embarrassment. And Gerald Voss, who held a quiet but significant position on the board of Whitmore Global through a holding company most people didn't know to connect to him, had been waiting for 19 years for Alexandra Whitmore to do something he could use. He looked at the photo of Lexa leaning close to the Navy officer, laughing in a way the cameras never caught, and he smiled. "Well," he said to no one, "isn't this interesting?" And he picked up his phone and made the first of several calls that would within 10 days turn a quiet photograph into a national story and a billionaire's private weekend into a war she didn't yet know she was fighting. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Lexa was on the phone with Daniel while Emma sang in the background, and Daniel laughed at something the girl said. Lexa's other line lit up Marcus. She almost didn't answer. She wished for the rest of her life that she hadn't. "Lexa, I'm sorry to interrupt your call," he said, and something in his voice was wrong, was tight, was scared. "But you need to look at the news, right now, all of it." "What is it?" "It's you," Marcus said. "And a Navy officer. There's a photo. It's Lexa, it's everywhere. And the board is already calling. All of them. At once." In the background, 800 miles away, she could still hear Emma singing, and Daniel laughing, and the small warm sound of the life she'd just begun to believe she could have. And on every screen in America, a single photograph was beginning to burn. The headline that hurt the most wasn't even the cruelest one. By noon, Lexa had read them all. She sat in her office with the door closed and the blinds drawn and her phone face down on the desk because it would not stop buzzing, and she scrolled through them on her laptop with a kind of clinical horror, the way you might watch footage of your own house burning. CEO's secret romance, who is the mystery? Navy man billionaire, Whitmore's hidden relationship exposed. Is Whitmore Global's future at risk over CEO's personal life, and the one that made something cold settle into her stomach? Single dad or strategic distraction? Inside the Navy officer, romancing America's richest woman. They had his name. By 2 o'clock, they had his name. Lieutenant Daniel Carter, and his rank, and his base, and God help her a photograph of him in uniform, pulled from some change of command ceremony, his tired, honest face plastered across every screen in the country, with words underneath it that turned a private man into public property. She called him before the board, before her lawyers, before anyone. He answered on the second ring. "Lexa." His voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a man who'd already seen it. "You okay? Am I okay?" She nearly laughed, except nothing was funny. "Daniel, they have your name. They have your picture. They're calling you a strategy, a distraction. They went through your service record." "How do they have your service record? People can find anything if they want it bad enough." He was quiet a moment. "I had a feeling the second I saw the first headline that this was going to land harder on you than me. So I'm going to ask you one time, and I need you to tell me the truth." A pause. "Is this going to hurt your company?" And there it was, the thing that broke her heart clean in half. America was burning his name to the ground, dragging his daughter into a scandal she hadn't earned, and the first thing he wanted to know was whether she was going to be okay. "Don't," she said, her voice cracking. "Don't you dare worry about my company right now. Worry about yourself. Worry about Emma. Does she know?" "Not yet." His voice dropped. "But she will. Kids talk. Their parents talk. By tomorrow, somebody at that school is going to say something to her, and I won't be there to soften it because I've got a unit that just found out their logistics officer is a tabloid headline and a CO who wants to see me at 0800. He exhaled. "So no, Lexa. I'm not okay, but not for the reasons you think. I don't care what they say about me. I'm a grown man. I've been called worse by better. I care that my kid's about to pay for something she had nothing to do with. That's the part I can't forgive." Lexa closed her eyes. "I did this. I came to Norfolk. I should have known better. Someone at that wedding, someone took a picture, and I never even—" "Stop." His voice was firm now, the voice of a man used to giving orders that needed following. "You didn't do this. Some coward with a camera and somebody with money and a grudge did this. You and I had grilled cheese and lost at Candyland. That's not a scandal. That's a Tuesday." A breath. "Don't take this on yourself. That's exactly what they want, for you to feel guilty enough to do something stupid." "Like what?" There was a silence on the line. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was quieter and sadder, and it told her he already understood the shape of what was coming better than she did. Like, cut me loose, he said. To make it go away. That's what they're going to tell you to do, Lexa. The smart people in suits. They're going to tell you the cleanest way out is to put out a statement, distance yourself, call it a misunderstanding. And the thing is, his voice didn't waver, but it cost him. She could hear it costing him. They won't be wrong. From where they sit, that is the smart play. So if that's what you decide, I want you to know in advance that I'll understand. I won't hold it against you. You've got thousands of employees and shareholders and a company your father built, and Emma and I are two people you've known 6 weeks. The math doesn't math. I told you that. It never did. Daniel. I mean it. Whatever you have to do. Emma and I will be fine. We were fine before, we'll be fine after. He paused. But I needed to say it now before the suits get to you, so you'd hear it from me first. So you'd know there's an exit, and that I'm not going to make it ugly if you take it. And the worst part, the part Lexa would remember for the rest of her life, was that he meant it. He was giving her permission to leave him. He was so used to being the thing that got cut, the cost that got managed. The man whose life made the math harder, he was handing her the knife and turning his cheek. No, Lexa said. Lexa, no. Listen to me. She stood up, the laptop, forgotten the headlines, forgotten. You are not a cost to be managed. You don't get to do that. You don't get to decide for me that I'm going to leave before I've even... Her voice broke, and she forced it level. I have to go into a board meeting in an hour. I don't know what's going to happen in it. I don't know what they're going to demand. But I am not going to stand here and let you talk me into abandoning you to make my own life easier. That's not who I want to be anymore. You taught me that. So don't you dare take it back now. The line was quiet. Go to your CO, she said. Hold your daughter when you can, and trust me for one more day. Can you do that? A long pause. Okay, Daniel said softly. One more day. The board meeting was at 4. She'd been in 1,000 of them. She knew every face around that table, knew their loyalties and their leverage, knew who'd vote which way before they opened their mouths. They were by and large her people she'd appointed. Half of them survived the other half. But when she walked in at 4 o'clock, she felt the temperature in the room and knew with the same instinct that had built her company that this one was different. Gerald Voss was sitting at the far end. She hadn't even known he was coming. He held his seat through a holding company rarely attended in person, was the kind of board member who voted by proxy, and made his presence felt through whispers rather than appearances. But there he was, in a charcoal suit, hands folded with the patient look of a man who had waited a very long time and was finally enjoying himself. Alexandra, he said, I think we should begin. This is my meeting, Gerald, she said evenly, taking her seat at the head of the table. I'll decide when we begin. Of course, he smiled. Of course. The chairman, a silver-haired man named Whitcomb, who'd served on the board since her father's day, and had always been fair to her, cleared his throat. Alexandra, I think you know why we're here. The coverage. It's everywhere. Our communications team has been fielding calls all day. 2 of our institutional investors have already reached out with concerns. The stock dipped 3% this morning before recovering. He spread his hands not unkindly. We need a strategy, today. Then let's have one, Lexa said. I'm listening. It was Voss who answered, smooth as oil. I think the strategy is rather obvious, isn't it? We have a CEO, a brilliant one, no one disputes it, whose personal judgment has, shall we say, become a liability. A military man with a child. A romance conducted in secret. The optics suggest impulsiveness, instability. Investors don't like instability in the person controlling the supply chain of half the country. He turned his hands palm up, reasonable, devastating. The solution is simple. A statement. Today. Clarifying that there is no relationship. That the photograph was a misunderstanding, a brief professional conversation at a social event, nothing more. We distance the company entirely from this Lieutenant Carter and his domestic situation. We make it clear that Whitmore Global's leadership is focused, stable, and singular, And in a week the story dies for lack of oxygen. Around the table heads nodded. Not all of them, but enough. Lexa watched them nod, watched the smart, reasonable, frightened people she'd worked with for years agree that the cleanest path was to erase a Navy father and his 7-year-old daughter from existence with a press release. "And the child?" Lexa asked. Voss blinked. "I'm sorry. Lieutenant Carter has a daughter, Emma. She's 7. Lexa kept her voice flat, controlled the voice she used when she was most dangerous, and people who knew her knew to be careful. "She's being talked about in the press as part of a strategic distraction. She's going to walk into her 2nd-grade classroom tomorrow and have other children ask her if her dad is dating a billionaire for her money. So when you say we distance the company from his domestic situation, I want to be precise about what we're discussing. We're discussing whether this company puts out a statement that publicly humiliates a 7-year-old to protect a 3% stock dip that already recovered." She looked down the table at Voss. "Is that an accurate summary, Gerald, of the obvious strategy?" Voss's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes shifted. "You're being emotional, Alexandra, which is frankly the concern. This is a business decision. The child is regrettable, but not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to our shareholders." "Our responsibility," Lexa said, "is to run a company that I'm not ashamed to put my name on. The name happens to be Whitmore, which is also my name in case that detail escaped you. Your father," Voss said, and now the velvet came off the blade, "would have put out the statement before lunch. Your father understood that this company comes before any individual, including, I might remind you, before any individual Whitmore. He built it to survive, not to be a vehicle for one woman's midlife search for meaning." The table went very still. It was a calculated cruelty, and it found its mark because it was the one weapon that had always worked on her. Your father. The dead man whose last instruction had run her life for 12 years. Never let anyone take it from you. Voss was reaching for that instruction like a key, turning it, expecting the same machine to engage that had always engaged. And Lexa felt it. The old reflex, the pull, the voice that said, "He's right, the company comes first. The company is everything, the company is who you are." She felt the pull of 19 years of obedience to a dead man's fear. And then she heard a different voice, a tired, even unhurried voice on a back step under actual stars. "Will I be able to look my daughter in the face and tell her I did the right thing even when the right thing cost me? That's the whole thing. Everything else is noise. Or whoever it is you'd be ashamed to lie to. Everybody's got somebody. Find that person and you've got your compass." She had spent her whole life without that person. She didn't anymore. She had a 7-year-old who taught her Candyland, and a man who told her she wasn't enough and made her want to be more. And she knew with a clarity that felt like cold water that if she put out Voss's statement, if she sat at this table and traded Emma Carter's dignity for a recovered stock price, she would never be able to look either of them in the face again. She would have failed the only test that had ever actually mattered. "My father," Lexa said, and her voice was very quiet now, which was how everyone at that table knew the meeting had just changed. "Told me to never let anyone take this company from me. And for 12 years, I thought that meant I had to protect it from the outside, from rivals, from buyers, from people who wanted what was mine." She stood up slowly, and the room came up with her inattention. "It took me 12 years and a Navy logistics officer to understand that the only person who's been trying to take this company from me is me. By disappearing into it. By forgetting it was supposed to be a thing I did not, a thing I was." "Alexandra," Whitcomb started. "I'm not finished, Charles." She put her hands flat on the table and leaned into them. "Gerald wants a statement. He's right that we need one. So here's the statement we're going to put out." She looked around the table, meeting each face in turn. "Whitmore Global confirms that its CEO is a human being. That she has in her personal life formed a connection with a decorated United States Navy officer who has served this country for over 20 years and is, as we speak, preparing to deploy overseas to do a job that protects the very supply chains this company profits from. The company further confirms that it will not be commenting on its CEO's private life, that it considers the targeting of a serving officer's minor child to be beneath contempt, and that any media outlet pursuing a 7-year-old for this story can expect to hear from our legal department. She straightened. That's the statement. The silence was absolute. Then Voss laughed a short, ugly sound. You can't be serious. You'd stake the company's stability on a fling, on a man you've known 6 weeks. I'd stake it on the truth, Lexa said, which is more than you've ever staked anything on Gerald. The board will not stand for this. Voss's mask was fully off now, the smooth gone, the grudge naked. You think you're untouchable. You think the Whitmore name protects you. I've watched you for 19 years. Alexandra watched you build this empire on your father's foundation and take all the credit. And now you've finally handed us the rope. A board can remove a CEO whose judgment is compromised, and there's not a person at this table who can look at this circus and call your judgment sound. He looked around. I move for a vote of no confidence, effective immediately. And there, it was the real play. The one he'd been building toward since a man with a camera embarrassed him at a wedding 9 months in the planning. Not a statement. A coup. He'd never wanted to manage the scandal. He'd wanted to use it to take her chair. Lexa felt her heart hammering, but her face stayed still. She had been in this exact kind of room before, the moment where someone reaches for your throat, and she had survived every one of them. But she'd survived them as a fortress alone, trusting no one. This was different. This time, she wasn't fighting for the company. This time, she was fighting for a 7-year-old in Norfolk who liked a fish named President. You want a vote, Gerald, she said. Fine, let's have a vote. But before we do, I want everyone at this table to understand exactly what they're voting on. Because Gerald's framed it as a vote about my judgment. It isn't. She looked around. It's a vote about what this company is. Gerald is asking you to remove me for the crime of refusing to humiliate a child to protect a stock price. That's the actual question. Not whether I dated a Navy officer. Whether the leadership of this company believes that a recovered 3% dip is worth more than a little girl's dignity. She let it sit. So go ahead. Whoever agrees with Gerald that we should run this company by erasing inconvenient children, raise your hand. And know that I'll remember it. And know that I'll make sure the people who depend on this company remember it too. Because I am still, as of this moment, the largest shareholder, the founder's daughter, and the woman whose name is on the building. Vote however you like. But vote knowing exactly what you're choosing. She sat back down. And she waited. The table did not move. Whitcomb looked at Voss. Voss looked at the board. And one by one, the faces that had nodded along to the clean, smart, reasonable statement an hour ago, the frightened, sensible people looked at Alexandra Whitmore, who had just dared them in plain words to be the kind of people who threw away a child for a press cycle. Gerald, Whitcomb said slowly, has moved for a vote of no confidence. Is there a second? The silence stretched. Is there a second? Whitcomb repeated. No one spoke. Lexa watched Gerald Voss's face cycle through disbelief, then fury. Then the cold calculation of a man recalculating in real time how badly he'd misjudged the room. He'd been so certain. He'd had the photograph, the headlines, the leverage, the dead father's ghost. He'd had everything but the one thing he never understood, because men like him never did that. When you force a room full of frightened, decent people to look at the actual ugly thing they're being asked to do. Sometimes, just sometimes, they refuse. This isn't over, Voss said, gathering his things, his voice low and venomous. You think you've won something here. You've just made an enemy who isn't going anywhere. I've had enemies for 19 years, Gerald, Lexa said. I built an empire surrounded by them. You're not even an interesting one. She turned to the chairman. Charles, are we adjourned? We're adjourned, Whitcomb said. And then more quietly, with something in his old eyes that might have been respect, or might have been the memory of her father. That was either the bravest thing I've seen in this room or the most reckless. I haven't decided which. Neither have I, Charles, Lexa admitted. But it was the right one, I'm sure of that part. She walked out of this boardroom with her heart still pounding and her hands not quite steady, and she went straight to her office and closed the door, and she called Daniel. He answered on the first ring. Lexa. What happened? Are you? I didn't do it, she said. Her voice was shaking now that there was no one to see it shake. They wanted me to put out a statement, to say there was no relationship, to distance the company from you and from Emma, to call her a misunderstanding. She pressed her hand against her mouth for a second, then went on. And one of them tried to use it to remove me, to take my chair. He brought up my father, he had it all planned. And Daniel, for 1 second, I almost did it. The old part of me almost did it. But you didn't, Daniel said quietly. No, Lexa said. I didn't. I told them the truth instead. All of it. I told a room full of the most powerful people in my world that I would burn the whole thing down before I'd let them hurt a 7-year-old to protect a stock price. She laughed a broken, amazed sound. And Daniel, they backed down. He called for a vote to remove me, and not one person seconded it. Not one. I won. I think I won. But I didn't win the way I've always won. I didn't win by being colder or smarter or more ruthless. Her voice cracked completely now. I won by telling the truth. For the first time in my life, I won by telling the truth. There was a long silence on the line. When Daniel spoke, his voice wasn't quite steady either. You protected my daughter, he said. You stood in a room full of people who could end you, and you protected a kid who isn't even yours, who you've known for 1 weekend. A pause, and she could hear him breathe. Lexa, do you understand what you just did? Do you understand who that makes you? I think, Lexa said softly. It makes me somebody I'd actually be able to look in the face. Finally, and 800 miles away in a small house in Norfolk, a man who had spent his whole life being the cost that got managed sat down slowly at his kitchen table and for the first time in longer than he could remember, found he couldn't quite speak. In the next room, a 7-year-old girl named Emma called out, Dad, who are you talking to? And Daniel Carter wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and managed to answer. A friend, baby, he said. A really good friend. Winning the boardroom didn't end the war. It just moved it somewhere Lexa couldn't reach. The statement went out that evening exactly as she'd written it, and for about 36 hours, it worked. The way truth sometimes works, it landed like a slap. It confused the people who'd expected a denial, and a few honest reporters actually wrote pieces with headlines like, Billionaire CEO refuses to disavow. Navy officer threatens outlets, targeting his child. For 36 hours, Lexa let herself believe the worst was over. Then Gerald Voss showed her what a man with money and a grudge could do when he stopped working through boardrooms and started working through the dark. It started with Emma. Daniel called her on Thursday night, and the moment she heard his voice, she knew something was wrong, because the careful control was gone, replaced by something raw, something close to fury. They got to the school, he said. What do you mean they got to the school? There was a man outside the pickup line today, with a camera, asking the other parents about Emma, asking the kids. His voice was tight as a wire. One of the other moms saw him and called me. By the time I got there, he was gone, but Lexa, he was asking second graders questions about my daughter. About whether her dad was the Navy guy from the news. About whether I had money now. About her mother. He exhaled hard. And it worked. Some kid went home and told his parents, and now it's all over the school. Emma came home today and asked me why people keep looking at her. She asked me if she did something wrong. Lexa felt something go cold and then very, very hot. What did you tell her? I told her she didn't do anything wrong. I told her some grown-ups are acting like children, and it has nothing to do with her. His voice cracked just slightly. But she's 7, Lexa. She doesn't understand why strangers care about her dad. She doesn't understand why the kids who used to play with her are whispering. She just knows that something changed, and she thinks it's her fault. And I can't. He stopped. I can't fix it. I can fix almost anything for her. I can braid her hair and fight her nightmares and make her favorite dinner. But I can't make the whole country stop looking at her. And I deploy in 9 days. Daniel. Lexa stood in her penthouse, looking out at the city, and felt the full weight of what she'd brought into his life. I'm going to fix this. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to fix it. This is my fault. Stop saying that. It is. You and Emma had a quiet life and I walked into it, and now there are men with cameras at her school. That's on me, so it's mine to fix." Her mind was already moving, already running the cold, fast calculations it ran best. The man at the school, was he press or was he hired? Does it matter? It matters a great deal, Lexa said. Press is sloppy in public. A hired man is targeted. If someone's paying people to harass a 7-year-old, that's not a news story. That's a campaign. And campaigns have a person paying for them. She was very still. Gerald. Who? Gerald Voss, the board member who tried to remove me. He's the one who bought the original photo from the wedding. I had my security team trace it after the meeting. He's been planning this for 9 months, ever since I embarrassed him by walking away from him to sit with you. Her voice hardened. He lost the boardroom, so now he's trying to win the other way. Make my personal life so toxic, so painful that I cut you loose just to make it stop. He's not after the company anymore. He's after you. Because he knows you're the thing I won't trade, and he wants to prove I will. There was a long silence on the line. Then he doesn't know you, Daniel said quietly. No, Lexa said. He doesn't, but he's about to. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk, and she did the thing she was best in the world, at the thing 19 years of empire. Building had honed to a razor. She gathered information, and she found leverage, and she built a case. By dawn, she had her head of security, a former federal investigator named Reyes, on a video call. And by noon, Reyes had confirmed what Lexa already knew in her gut. The man at the school, Reyes said, works for a reputation management firm called Halloran Strategic. Off-the-books work, the kind of firm that doesn't exist on paper. We traced 2 payments. Both came through a shell company. The shell company's only other activity in the last 2 years was a single large transfer from Voss Capital, Lexa finished. Voss Capital, Reyes confirmed. We can prove it. The paper trail's thin, but it's there. A man named Gerald Voss is paying a firm to surveil and harass a minor child for the purpose of pressuring you. That's not a board dispute anymore, Ms. Whitmore. Depending on how it's charged, that's stalking. Possibly harassment of a minor. Definitely something his other investors would be very interested to learn about. Lexa sat back. 6 weeks ago, she'd have known exactly what to do with this. She'd have used it the way she used everything, as a weapon leveraged for maximum advantage, deployed coldly to destroy a man who'd come at her. And part of her, the old part, the Whitmore part, wanted to do exactly that. Wanted to burn Gerald Voss to the ground so thoroughly that no one would ever again mistake her for someone who could be pushed. But she heard Daniel's voice again, the one that had become her compass. Will I be able to look my daughter in the face? She thought about what she actually wanted. Not what would win, what she wanted. She wanted the men to leave Emma alone. She wanted a 7-year-old to stop thinking she'd done something wrong. She wanted a small house in Norfolk to be quiet again before a father had to leave it for 9 months. That was the goal. Not vengeance, not domination. Just safety for a child who'd never asked for any of this. Reyes, she said, I want you to do 2 things. First, document everything, airtight. I want a file so complete it could survive a courtroom. She paused. Second, I want you to find out everything about Gerald Voss's investors. The pension funds, the institutions, the people whose money he manages. I want to know who they are and what they care about. You're going to expose him? No, Lexa said slowly. I'm going to give him a choice. The same kind of choice he tried to force on me. And then I'm going to find out what kind of man he really is when someone holds the knife instead of him. She flew to New York the next morning. Voss kept an office on the 40th floor of a glass tower, all chrome and ego, and he agreed to see her with the smug confidence of a man who thought he'd already won, who thought she'd come to negotiate her surrender. She walked in alone. No lawyers, no security. Just Alexandra Whitmore, and a single leather folder under her arm. Alexandra, Voss said, not rising. I have to admit I'm surprised. I didn't expect you to come crawling quite this fast. Have a seat. Tell me what you're prepared to offer to make all this go away. She didn't sit. I'm not here to offer you anything, Gerald. She set the folder on his desk. I'm here to give you the same thing you tried to give me, a statement to sign. He glanced at the folder, amused. And why would I sign anything you put in front of me? Open it. He did, with the lazy confidence of a man humoring a lesser opponent. And Lexa watched his face as he read. Watched the amusement curdle, watched the color drain, watched the exact moment Gerald Voss understood that the woman across his desk had spent her entire adult life learning how to do precisely this, and had simply, for 19 years, been doing it to other people. "This is fabricated," he said, but his voice had lost something. "It's a complete record of every payment Voss Capital routed through Halloran Strategic to surveil and harass a 7-year-old child," Lexa said calmly. "It's the photographs of your man outside Emma Carter's elementary school. It's the transcript of him questioning second graders. It's the wire transfers, the shell company, all of it. And the second folder," she nodded at the one beneath, "is a list of your major investors. The Kessler Pension Fund, the State Teachers Retirement System of 2 different states, the Ardmore Foundation, which you may recall funds children's hospitals." She let that sit. "I wonder how the Ardmore Foundation would feel about discovering that the man managing their endowment hired people to stalk a child. I wonder how the teacher's pension would feel. I imagine they'd want their money managed by someone whose name isn't attached to that. I imagine there'd be redemptions. I imagine, Gerald, that you'd be finished not in a board fight, not in a news cycle, but completely permanently, the kind of finished a man like you doesn't come back from." Voss's hands were flat on the desk, now very still. "What do you want?" "I want you to read the statement," Lexa said. "Out loud if you can manage it." He didn't read it out loud, but he read it, and she watched him read it, and she saw the muscle working in his jaw. It says, Lexa narrated for him that you are resigning your board seat at Whitmore Global, effective immediately for personal reasons. It says you are divesting your holdings on a schedule my legal team has set, and it includes a private legally binding agreement signed by you acknowledging that you directed the surveillance of a minor child, and stipulating that if any harm of any kind from any source ever comes to Daniel or Emma Carter again, this entire file goes to the SEC, to the FBI, and to every single one of your investors on the same afternoon. She paused. Sign it, and the file disappears into a vault and never sees daylight. Don't sign it, and I drop it tomorrow morning and watch you become the most radioactive man in finance by lunch. You're bluffing, Voss said. If you release that, you drag the Carters back into the news. The child gets exposed all over again. You'd never do that to her. You're too... He sneered the word sentimental now. And here was the moment. The old Lexa would have had no answer, because the old Lexa would have been exactly the kind of person who'd sacrifice anything to win, and Voss would have been right to call the bluff. But she wasn't that person anymore, and the strange, beautiful truth was that not being that person was exactly what made the threat real. You're half right, Lexa said quietly. 6 weeks ago I'd have bluffed and you'd have known it. But here's what you don't understand, Gerald, because you've never had something you actually loved. I would do anything to protect that little girl. Anything. And that includes the thing that costs me. Yes, if I release this file, Emma gets dragged through it again. It would break my heart, and I would still do it. Because the alternative is letting you believe you can come at her whenever you want forever, and I will not raise a child. She stopped hearing the word she'd used, raise a child, and didn't take it back. Who grows up thinking the people who love her can be scared off. So no, I'm not bluffing. You taught me that the people who win are the ones willing to pay the price the other side won't. You were right about that. You were just wrong about which one of us that was. The office was silent except for the hum of the city 40 floors down. Gerald Voss picked up the pen. He signed it, all of it. And when he was done, he pushed it across the desk without looking at her and said in a voice stripped of every ounce of its earlier velvet, "Get out of my office." "Gladly," Lexa said. She gathered the signed pages, slid them into her folder, and walked to the door. Then she stopped and turned back, because there was one more thing, and it surprised her as much as it surprised him. "For what it's worth," she said, "you did me a favor. 9 months ago, you bought a photograph to embarrass me. And all you did was make me look at the only honest thing in my life and decide to keep it." She almost smiled. "So thank you, Gerald. Sincerely. You're a small, frightened man, and you tried to hurt a child, and I hope I never see you again. But thank you." And she left. She called Daniel from the back of the car, and she told him all of it, the file, the meeting, the signature, the end of it. And when she finished, there was a long silence, and then Daniel said, his voice thick, "You went into that man's office alone, with no protection, and you stared him down." "I've been staring men like him down for 19 years, Lexa said. "The only difference this time is I knew what I was fighting for." "It's over?" he asked. "It's really over. He's gone, Daniel, off the board, divesting and bound by an agreement that ends his career if anyone so much as looks at Emma sideways. The men at the school gone, I've already confirmed it. The press will move on, they always do. There's a new story by Monday." She let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 2 weeks. "It's over. Your daughter can go back to being a 7-year-old, I promise." She heard him swallow. "Lexa, I've spent my whole life being the guy who handles things himself, who doesn't ask, who doesn't need anybody, and you walked into a war I couldn't fight, and you ended it for a kid who isn't even—" He stopped. "Say it," Lexa said softly. "Who isn't even mine. That's what you keep almost saying." "Yeah," Daniel admitted. "Who isn't even yours?" "Who?" "Daniel," Lexa said. And she watched the city go by, and she said the truest thing she'd said in 19 years. "I've never had a child. I made that choice a long time ago because I thought my life didn't have room. I thought I didn't have it in me. And then I lost 3 games of Candyland to a 7-year-old, and I sat in a boardroom and threatened to burn down everything my father built rather than let anyone hurt her." She paused. "She doesn't have to be mine by blood for me to know I'd do anything for her. You taught me what a compass is. She's part of mine now, whether that's allowed or not. Whether the maths or not." The line was quiet for a long moment. "It's 9 days," Daniel said finally. "Until I leave. 9 months gone after that." "I know. And I'm still a single dad with a government salary and a fish named president and a daughter who needs stability more than anything in the world. None of that changed. The scandal's gone, but the life's the same." His voice was careful, the voice of a man protecting the one thing he couldn't lose. "I need to know you understand that. The dramatic part is over. What's left is the boring, hard daily part. The part where I'm gone and you're running an empire and a little girl is growing up in between. That part doesn't have a boardroom showdown in it. It's just showing up, over and over, when it's not exciting, when it's inconvenient. That's the actual thing, Lexa. Not the rescue, the staying." And Lexa understood that this was the real question, the one underneath all the others. Not whether she'd fight for them in a crisis. She'd proven that. The question was whether she'd be there in the long, undramatic ordinariness afterward, the Tuesdays, and the homework, and the 9-month silences when there was no enemy to defeat, and no victory to win, just a life to be present for. "Daniel," she said, "I've spent 19 years being good at the dramatic part. Boardrooms, takeovers, crises. I'm the best in the world at the dramatic part." She took a breath. "I have no idea how to do the boring part, the staying part. I've never once in my life stayed anywhere that wasn't a battlefield." She looked out at the city. "But I want to learn. I want to learn it with you and with her. And I'm going to be bad at it at first. I'm going to fly off to deals and forget how to do homework and probably lose at Candyland for the rest of my life. But I want to learn. Will you let me learn?" There was a sound on the other end of the line that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. "Emma's going to want you at her birthday," Daniel said. "It's in 3 weeks. I'll already be gone. My sister's doing it." He paused. "She'd lose her mind if you came. She talks about you constantly. The lady from the phone. She told her whole class the lady from the phone is her dad's friend, and the lady is very smart and very rich and very nice." A breath. "She believes in you, Lexa. Already. That kid believes in you. So if you're going to learn the staying part, learn it carefully. Because she's already decided you're staying. And if you break that, you won't be breaking it with me. You'll be breaking it with her. And I can survive a lot of things. I can't survive that." "I won't break it," Lexa said. "I give you my word. And I've never given my word to anyone and meant it the way I mean it right now." "Okay," Daniel said. And she could hear finally the thing letting go in him, the wariness, the armor, the lifetime of being the cost that got managed. Okay. Then come to the birthday. Learn the staying part, and we'll figure out the rest as we go. As we go, Lexa agreed. She hung up, and she sat in the back of the car as the city slid by, and Alexandra Whitmore, who had walked into a glass tower that morning and ended a war with a single folder, who had spent 19 years winning by being colder and harder and more ruthless than anyone in the room, put her hand over her mouth and cried. Not from grief. Not from fear. From the overwhelming, terrifying, unfamiliar feeling of having something to lose, and choosing with her whole heart to keep it anyway. The deployment came on a gray Tuesday morning 9 days later, and she was there for it, standing on a Norfolk pier she'd never imagined she'd see, holding the hand of a 7-year-old girl who'd already decided she was staying, watching a Navy logistics officer in his working uniform crouch down to say goodbye to his daughter for 9 months, and then slowly rise and look at the billionaire holding that daughter's hand with an expression that had no name in the language of boardrooms. But that goodbye, and what Lexa promised on that pier, and the 9 months that came after that, was still ahead of them. The pier was cold that gray Tuesday morning, and Emma's small hand was tight in Lexa's, and neither of them was watching the enormous ship. They were watching the man walking toward it. Daniel had said his goodbyes already. He'd crouched down on the wet concrete in his working uniform, eye to eye with his daughter. And he'd said the things he always said before a deployment, the things he'd worked out over 4 years of leaving. Daddy's always coming back. You're going to be brave. You're going to be exactly who you are. And I'm going to be thinking about you every single day, even when I can't call. And Emma, who had done this before, and was better at it than any 7-year-old should have had to be, had nodded with her chin trembling and said, "Come back, Daddy," in a voice so small it broke something in Lexa she hadn't known was still whole. And then Daniel had stood up, and he'd looked at Lexa over Emma's head, and there was a question in his face that he didn't say out loud, because it was too big for words on a pier. Will you really be here? Will she really not be alone? Can I actually leave the way I've never been able to leave, knowing someone's holding her hand? Lexa answered it without him asking. Go, she said. We've got it. I promise you, Daniel, we've got it. He held her eyes 1 second longer. Then he reached out and squeezed her shoulder. Not a kiss. Not in front of the unit. Not Daniel. Just one firm, steady grip that said everything. And he turned and walked toward the ship with the bag over his shoulder and the careful, unhurried gait of a man who had learned how to walk away from the thing he loved most without breaking stride, because breaking stride was a luxury his life had never allowed. Emma watched him go up the gangway. She didn't cry until he was out of sight, and then she cried hard the way only children can, her whole body shaking with it. And Lexa got down on her knees on the cold concrete in a coat that cost more than Daniel's monthly salary, and pulled the little girl into her arms and held her. I've got you, Lexa said into her hair. I've got you, sweetheart. He's coming back. I promise you he's coming back. And until he does, you're not alone. Not for one single day. Do you hear me? Not one. You promise, Emma sobbed. I promise, Lexa said. And she had made 1,000 promises in 19 years to investors, to boards, to partners, promises engineered for leverage and broken when leverage shifted. This was the first one she knew with total certainty she would die before she broke. The 9 months that followed were the hardest and the most important of Alexandra Whitmore's life. She did not move to Norfolk. She couldn't. The company was real. 11,000 employees were real. But she did something she'd never done in 19 years. She restructured her own life around someone else's. She set up an apartment near Emma's school. She arranged her travel so that she was there 4 days out of every 7, and on the 3, she wasn't Daniel's sister covered, and they built a rhythm, a clumsy, improvised, deeply human rhythm around the absence of one man 8,000 miles away. And she was bad at it at first, exactly like she'd warned him she would be. She missed a parent-teacher conference in the 3rd week because a deal in Frankfurt ran long, and she flew back to find Emma quiet and wounded in a way that took 2 days to thaw, and Lexa sat on the floor of the girls' bedroom and apologized to a 7-year-old with more sincerity than she'd ever apologized to anyone. My dad never misses them, Emma said, not cruelly, just truthfully. Even when he's far away, he calls in. He has a whole computer thing." "You're right," Lexa said. "I should have done that. I made a mistake, and I'm going to do better. Will you give me another chance to do better?" Emma considered this with her father's serious eyes. "Okay," she said finally, "but you have to come to the next one in person, and you can't be on your phone." "Deal," Lexa said. And she meant it, and she never missed another one, and she put her phone in a drawer every evening at 6 a.m. that her entire executive team found so alarming they initially assumed she was ill. She learned to braid hair. Badly at first, Emma's braids came out lopsided and lumpy, and Emma laughed at them in the mirror, but Lexa watched videos late at night, the way she'd once studied acquisition targets, and by month 4, she could do a French braid that held, and the first time Emma said, "That's a good one." Lexa felt a flush of pride more total than anything a quarterly report had ever given her. She learned the boring part. The staying part. She learned what Daniel had tried to tell her on the back steps under the stars, that the actual substance of love wasn't the rescue, wasn't the boardroom showdown, wasn't the dramatic stand. It was showing up, over and over, on the Tuesdays, when it was inconvenient, when there was no enemy to defeat and no victory to win. She learned to sit through a second-grade music recital that lasted 90 minutes for the 4 minutes Emma was on stage. She learned to make grilled cheese the way Daniel made it with the butter on the outside and the heat low. She learned that a 7-year-old's nightmares come at 2 in the morning and don't care that you have a board call at 8, and that the only cure is to sit on the edge of the bed and say, "I'm here, I'm here. Nothing's going to hurt you," until the small, shaking body finally settles back into sleep. And Daniel called when he could. Satellite connections that cut out every 90 seconds exactly like he'd said. 9-minute windows where the 3 of them, Daniel on a screen, 8,000 miles away. Emma cross-legged on the floor. Lexa beside her tried to be a family across a connection that kept dropping. Emma would hold up her drawings to the camera. Daniel would tell her about the ocean, the parts he was allowed to tell. And sometimes, when Emma was distracted, Daniel would look at Lexa through the grainy, pixelated feed and just look at her, and neither of them would say anything because there was nothing to say that the look didn't say better. "You're doing it," he told her once near month 6, his voice crackling across half the planet. The staying part. "You're actually doing it." "I'm doing it badly," Lexa said. "No," Daniel said. "You're doing it like someone who's never done it before and is trying with everything she's got." "That's not badly, Lexa. That's the only way anybody ever learns it. There's no doing it well the first time. There's just showing up while you figure it out. And you're showing up." The connection crackled. "Emma told me last week that she stopped being scared. She said, 'I used to be scared when you left Daddy, but now I'm not as scared because Lexa's here.'" His voice caught on the satellite delay, or maybe on something else. "Do you know what that's worth to me? Do you have any idea I've spent 4 years leaving that kid terrified, and now she's not, because of you?" And Lexa, who had built an empire and didn't know how to receive a gift, sat in a small apartment near an elementary school, and let those words land and understood that she had finally built the only thing that had ever actually mattered, and that it had no balance sheet, and no shareholders, and no name on a building. Just a little girl who wasn't as scared anymore. The company strangely did better than ever. She'd half expected the scandal to cost her expected the wounded thing of the boardroom to fester. Instead, something she never could have predicted happened. The statement she'd put out, the one Voss had wanted her to never write, the one where she refused to disavow a Navy officer and threatened anyone who came after his child, it traveled. Not the way scandals travel. The way truth travels. People shared it. A woman who ran a veterans organization wrote an open letter praising her. Service members' spouses, thousands of them, the invisible army of people who held lives together while someone they loved was deployed, saw a billionaire CEO refuse to treat a military family as collateral damage, and they did not forget it. Whitmore Global's reputation didn't suffer. It transformed. Lexa found herself, almost by accident, becoming something she'd never been, not just a titan, but a person, a human being, with a heart that could be seen, and the market, it turned out, did not punish that the way Voss had sworn it would. It rewarded it, because people in the end would rather give their business to a company run by someone they believed had a soul. Your father, Whitcomb the old chairman, told her over lunch around month 7, spent his whole life afraid someone would take this company from him. He built it like a fortress. The old man shook his head. You opened the gates and let people see who was inside. And it turns out they liked her better than the fortress. He raised his glass. I think he'd have been proud, Alexandra. I think the version of him that wasn't scared would have been very proud. I think? Lexa said, the version of him that wasn't scared is the version I never got to meet. But I'd like to believe you're right. Gerald Voss was never heard from again, not in any way that mattered. He divested on the schedule her lawyers set, resigned every board he sat on, and faded into the gray anonymity of a man whose name no longer opened doors. The file stayed in its vault. Lexa never had to use it. She'd been right about that too, that the threat was only real because she'd actually been willing to pay its price. And a man like Voss could feel the difference between a bluff and a woman who'd stopped being afraid of losing. And then on a bright morning in the 10th month, deployments always run long. Exactly like Daniel had said, the ship came home. Lexa stood on the same pier where she'd watched it leave, and this time she wasn't holding Emma's hand, because Emma couldn't hold still, was bouncing on her toes in a dress she'd picked herself, scanning the rows of sailors coming down the gangway with a desperate, focused intensity. And Lexa stood behind her, with her hand resting light on the girl's shoulder, and her own heart was doing something it had not done in 19 years of cool control. It was pounding. It was terrified. It was completely helplessly open. There! Emma screamed. Daddy, there! And then the girl was running, breaking from Lexa's hand and tearing down the pier, and Daniel Carter dropped his bag on the concrete and went down on one knee just in time to catch the small body that hit him at full speed. And he wrapped his arms around his daughter and buried his face in her hair and held on, and Lexa watched from 20 feet away, as a man who had spent his whole life being strong, allowed himself for one moment in front of everyone to simply not let go. When he finally stood with Emma still clinging to him, he looked down the pier at Lexa. She didn't move. She didn't know if she was allowed to. 10 months of phone calls and dropped connections and a promise made on cold concrete, and now here he was, real and solid and home. And she suddenly didn't know what they were. Didn't know what she was permitted to be, this woman who'd raised his daughter for 9 months and had no name for what that made her. Daniel solved it the way he solved everything, simply, directly, without performance. He walked toward her, Emma on his hip, and he stopped in front of her, and he looked at her for a long moment with those tired, honest eyes that had noticed everything since the night they met, and he said, You stayed. I stayed, Lexa said. The whole time. The boring part. The hard part. All of it. All of it. And Daniel Carter, who had once told a billionaire that she had nothing he wanted, who had spent his whole life being the cost that got managed, and the man who handled things alone, shifted his daughter to one arm and reached out with the other, and pulled Alexandra Whitmore into the space he'd been holding open, the space she'd spent 10 months earning. And he held them both, the daughter who wasn't as scared anymore, and the woman who'd made her that way, right there on the pier in front of God, and the Navy, and anyone watching, and he didn't care who saw. Thank you, he said into her hair, his voice rough. For my daughter. For showing up. For being the thing I never let myself believe existed. Daniel. Lexa said, pulling back just enough to look at him, and the cool, composed billionaire was nowhere in her face. Now there was just a woman who'd finally found her compass and followed it all the way home. I spent 19 years building an empire because I thought it was the biggest thing a person could build. And then I lost 3 games of Candyland and learned to braid hair and sat through a music recital, and I figured out I'd had it backwards the whole time. The empire was never the big thing. She put her hand against his face. This is the big thing, the two of you. This is the only thing I've ever built that I'd actually be proud to put my name on. Emma, squashed happily between them, piped up. Does this mean Lexa stays forever now? Daniel looked at Lexa. Lexa looked at Daniel. And the question that had haunted them since a corner table at a Washington wedding, the question of whether 2 people from 2 impossibly different worlds could actually choose each other, could make the math. Math could be a family across the distance between a penthouse and a base house, answered itself in the only way it ever could have. Yeah, baby, Daniel said, but he said it looking at Lexa. If she wants to, she stays forever. I want to, Lexa said. I have never wanted anything more in my entire life. They didn't get married right away. There was no fairy tale wedding, no fixing of everything in a single grand gesture, because that wasn't who either of them was, and it wasn't what the story had ever been about. What they had instead was better because it was real. They built it slowly, the way Daniel built everything, carefully, deliberately, in a way that would hold. Lexa kept the company, but she ran it differently. Now the way a person runs a thing they do instead of a thing they are. She took the weekends. She put the phone in the drawer at 6. She brought Emma to the office sometimes and let her spin in the big chair, and the executive team, who had once found their CEO terrifying, learned that the most dangerous woman in American business turned into something soft and silly around a little girl who liked a fish named President. Daniel kept serving because it was who he was, and Lexa would never have asked him to be someone else. That was the whole point, that she'd loved exactly the man he was. The single dad with the government salary and the worn photograph, and not some improved version of him. There were more deployments. There would always be more deployments. But now when he left differently. He left a daughter who wasn't as scared, and a woman who would be there every single day, and he carried with him on the other side of the planet the unbreakable knowledge that he was not anymore carrying his life alone. And the photograph, the worn one, the one he'd been holding at that corner table the night the most powerful woman in America noticed the one man who wasn't looking at her, he kept it. But he added to it. By the second year, there was a new photo in his wallet, folded just as carefully, of 3 people who didn't match on paper and made no sense to anyone who measured lives in dollars and access and power. A Navy logistics officer, a 7-year-old, now 8, now 9, and a billionaire who had walked across a ballroom out of nothing but curiosity and walked into the only life that had ever been worth living. People who heard the story sometimes asked Lexa what made her do it. What made her cross that room, sit at that table, choose that impossible, complicated, illogical life over the empire she could have protected so easily. And she always gave the same answer because it was the truest thing she knew. I spent my whole life, she'd say, being chased by people who wanted what I had. And then I met a man who told me to my face that nothing I had was worth anything to him. That my money couldn't read his daughter a bedtime story. That my power couldn't make her stop asking why her mother left. She'd smile that real smile that the cameras had never once caught in 19 years, and now caught all the time. He was the only person who ever told me I wasn't enough, and he was the only person who ever made me want to become more. Everyone else wanted what I had. He only ever cared about who I was. And it turned out, when somebody finally cared about that there was someone in there worth caring about after all. I just had to be brave enough to let her out. The man no one noticed at a wedding full of the powerful had turned out to be the only person in the room who saw clearly, who knew that status was noise, that the compass was a child's face. You couldn't bear to lie to that. The staying was the love, and the rescue was just the easy part. And the billionaire who dominated that room had turned out to be the one who needed saving. Not from an enemy, not from a scandal, but from a life so full of everything that it had no room left for anything that mattered. They were 2 people from completely different worlds. The math never did math. It was never supposed to. They chose each other anyway, and they stayed through the deployments and the distance and the long, undramatic Tuesdays, through everything that told them not to. And in the end, the staying was the whole story, and the staying was enough, and the staying was everything. And that is how a single dad in the Navy, the only man in a room of 300 who refused to look up, ended up being the one who taught the most powerful woman in America the one thing all her power could never buy, that you are never truly rich until you have something you would give it all away to keep.